Hi, and welcome to Maine Challenge. I am very happy to welcome to the program today two amazing members of the Penobscot Nation to talk about tribal sovereignty. It's an issue that we're taking up nationally and very importantly here in Maine. So let me welcome Darren Ranco, who is the head of the Native American program at the University of Maine at Orono and one of the most foremost Indigenous scholars in the country, and Sherri Mitchell, who is an attorney, an author, an advocate, the head of the Land Peace Foundation, and a dear friend. And I am very happy to have you both here at such an important time. It's way past time, way past due, and just let's just set the stage first of all. So last year, Maine passed the Indian Land Claims Act back in 1980, and it was signed by President Carter. And now, last year, the legislature finally, after way too long, took it up again to after 40 years to change it and make it better. And one of the big things in that Land Claims Act, as you will tell us more, is the change of sovereignty. And so that we actually grant sovereignty to all the tribes in the Wabanaki Federation. So before we start and get too far down this road, Sherri, tell us, or both, either of you, just would you define sovereignty? Because I think it's misunderstood and people don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about tribal sovereignty. So let's start with that.
I think it would be effective for us to both do that because
Okay, awesome.
Part of the dilemma. And so, I just want to thank you, Betsy, for having us, and thank Dr. Ranco for sharing this space as well. It's always a pleasure to have conversation with the two of you. But looking at the origin of the word, because it's important to understand where words come from. I always talk about that in regard to understanding the way that words are used in order to imbue power, that if the word comes out of a lineage of power taking, then the way that the word is understood in relation to that taking. And so when we think about sovereignty, one of the things that I read in the course of my studies is something by Vine Deloria Jr., where he talked about sovereignty emerging as a theological term from East Asia to express a deity that was all powerful, but also unpredictable. Like there was this arbitrary randomness associated with that type of power. You never knew where it was going to strike, if it was, associated with a vengeful god. And then Europeans, as they do, appropriated the term and started to use it in relation to their monarchs. And so then it started to be used in relation to power being exerted over and also falsely being associated with some type of divine inheritance or to justify the brutality and all-encompassing power that the monarchs had. And so when we think about sovereignty in terms of those origins, it's easy to understand how European Americans, the people who are commonly called white these days, how they might get a little bit nervous about the term sovereignty, because through the usage that's been associated with for them, it's about exerting power over. It's about self-empowerment. It's not about self-government. It's not about self-determination. It's all about the exertion over others and the taking of power from them. And so, as we're unpacking this subject, I think it's important to understand that origin, because it really does set the framework for some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. And I think that's very different from the indigenous notion of sovereignty, which of course has to be couched within that European discourse because it's a very colonial term in that it arrived here through colonization. It's not a word that we would use. So the word that we would use to define our own self-governing nature, right, or our self-governing powers is samagama. It's sagama wamsulu, and so that means self-government. We're in control of ourselves, essentially, is what it means. And so, the language being used is also really critically important in relation to how we have discourse around something. And so I think that piece is important to get out at the beginning. And I'm really interested to hear what Darren has to say about the term sovereignty.
Yeah.
Great, Sherri. That's a great definition. And Let me see if I can add, and thanks, Betsy, for including me in this discussion. I really admire both of you and your long work for social and Indigenous justice is really important. Yeah, I mean, just building a little bit off of what Sherri's saying, one of some of the frames that are really important is to think about sovereignty as legal. So in the European,
Construct, yeah.
AKA, right, white and frameworks, that it is only talks about or only imagines legal and juridical control over self and others, and over spaces too. And I think that is part of the problems, much like a lot of things in terms of when Indigenous people start to be recognized for our rights. There's a fear factor of we will do to the others what they did to us, which is, as Sherri mentioned, not in the frameworks that we mobilize. And I've had debates with some great scholars about this over the years. Some believe that sovereignty shouldn't be used at all when we talk about mobilizing our notions of this word, because it's simply not an accurate representation of what we're seeking as we explore our sovereign rights. So I would put the Mohawk scholar Tayaya Gay Alfred in that camp. Others, including, I think there's a lot of scholars who say the modifier, putting tribal in front of it, actually helps us along the way. So they won't say we as tribes are seeking sovereignty, but we are seeking tribal sovereignty. And they believe that modification captures some of these different cultural frames over how we understand the sort of implications of this legal and juridical control. And then just two more points. I think one of the things that actually, Betsy, you kind of framed it slightly inaccurately, which was we give tribes this, or there's a sort of rendering that the Settlement Act or anything that any European power has done is a transfer of sovereignty to tribal nations. And I know you know this, but these are retained rights, right? So that, and I think that's critically part of the misunderstanding in the state, because I think what we're seeking and where in its source is seen as a kind of special, we only get it because of some sort of happenstance of history and people feel guilty about it, but that's very far from the truth. It's only because of racism that it's been silenced in the way that we seek to express it. And then lastly, just because I love sharing this story because it represents a Wabanaki framework, and Sherri already talked about the sort of the self-government notion that we bring to the table. But one of my tribal mentors, Jim Sapir, the late Jim Sapir, was responsible for bringing these Capuchin monks down to the Pleasant Point reservation, Sabayak, over in down East Maine, and they were doing this language exchange. There were some Passamaquoddy language speakers, and they were talking about these different words, and they were like, what's your word for apple? What's your word for rock? What's your word? These sort of just trying to understand the conceptual basis of the language. And and they were talking in Passamaquoddy, of course, sort of how alive, these words are. There's a living element, because our words are actually our languages are verb-oriented languages, right? They're actually not part of a rubric of noun-oriented action, but actual action in the world as it exists. And they were like, well, what's the term for banana? And they had some new term, invented term, because we didn't have bananas,
right?
And they're like, oh, so is that active? And they're like, oh no, that's there's no life to that word. We just made it up like last week, or I don't think it was last week, but we made it up a few decades ago. And they're like, oh, why isn't it part of this vibrant, active kind of quality. And they were like, well, because it's not in this toolkit of how we divide up the world and how we kind of understand ourselves in relation to it. And we've, since this sharing of the story that Jim and others and they're responsible for, we often think of sovereignty like that, right? It is in some ways already dead, in terms of how we see ourselves in relation to the world and what we're seeking. But of course, things like legal and juridical control are implicated in the fact of how we seek to have our own self-government and manage our own affairs. Yeah. So that would be the only other pieces that I'd say to add to Sherri's already great definition.
Well, and it's so important because there's two really important things I think that feed into this current conversation. One is the idea of, and I think it feeds into the fear and the racism in this conversation, right? One is this idea of sovereignty as someone taking over, right? So it's like, oh, if we, and then of course the one that you pointed out, which is so clear, is like no one's giving back anything. This is stuff we stole. This is with stolen land. This is, so it's not, and I think both of those undercurrents of like, oh, we're so afraid, to give over control, and then, oh, well, we're giving back something. I think those underlie a lot of the conversations that white people have about this, and not the idea. And I think if it were framed as self-governance and, reclaiming what was rightly, belonged to the tribes and, indigenous people, then it's harder for white people to get wigged out about it, because it's like, oh no, everyone should have self-governance. That's sort of a basis of democracy, right? So anyway, I don't know. What do you think about that? Would you think it would make a difference, Sherri, if we could train white people to talk about it differently?
Well, I think that there's an assumption built in there. And I first just want to say that it's not something that was, it's something that is.
Is, right.
Seated with the tribes. And so one of the challenges I think that we have, Betsy, is this issue that we don't often talk about, which is willful ignorance. And so in order to be able to teach somebody, they have to be willing to learn. And in the last 6 weeks, I've had to testify a couple of times before a legislative committee. And there was one gentleman who was, part of an important committee within our legislature, the Maine legislature, who kept repeating over and over again a term that had been corrected for him at least half a dozen times during the course of that testimony. And when you have somebody who is pretending, I'm assuming they're pretending to not understand something, that I just can't understand this. I just can't understand this. And it's very, very simple, something very simple that's being explained to them. Then one or two things is happening, right? Either that person completely lacks the intelligence to serve in public office and should be removed, or they're choosing to be willfully ignorant and using a pretense of ignorance to justify the disallowance of equanimity, equality, and any type of justice for Abenaki nations. Okay. So in order for us to be able to have the conversation about can European Americans or white people be trained, then there has to be a willingness to learn. And when we start talking about those who are using power in abusive ways to take, and are trying to cloud that in something else, like that you talk about the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act, which there over time, we don't really know where, got changed to the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, where the word land just disappears, right? The word land just disappears. And then all of a sudden there's a taking of water rights. Yeah. And so when you have this kind of behavior going on where there's this trickery under the surface that, then people feign willful ignorance to that trickery when it's exposed. There's a challenge in being able to communicate and to have any type of honest discourse around these types of issues, because you have to be working with those who are willing to have integrity,
Mm-hmm.
or willing to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
and willing to come to the table in a good way, with a good.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, I totally agree. So let's talk about what's at stake here. So for hundreds of years, right, the right to govern yourselves was taken away, for, at least in terms of the big white structures. And so as and we know that in the Indian Land Claims Act that the tribes were described as municipalities, not as nations, right? And that had all kinds of implications. And the one of which is, I believe it's true, that we are now the only state in the country where the tribes are not designated as sovereign nations, right? Or as, self-governing nations. And so let's talk for a minute, explain about, am I right about that? And secondly, so what does that mean practically? So what does that mean? What things are making, how does that stifle the economic and the judicial and all the places of self-government?
Sherri, I actually think you might be better at answering this one.
Geez, I was going to rely on you, Darren. What's interesting is I used to work for a short period of time at the Department of Interior in DC in a solicitor's office. And while I was there, there were a group of tribes who came together to talk to the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, about the inequitable treatment that they were experiencing in the United States. And every single one of those tribes had their land claim settlement negotiated by Tom Tureen. Wow. And Tom Tureen, there's about 8 tribes, I believe, that are part of this group who had their land claims negotiated by Tom Tureen. And Maine is a place that has been very inhospitable to rectifying the errors that were made during those negotiations. But also to rectify the trickery that occurred in the 11th hour within the actual signing of the document. I can guarantee you there is nowhere and no time when the tribes agreed to be recognized as municipalities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of things here that that would, I think, need a bigger discussion for us.
Yeah, so much to unpack. Yeah.
To answer that question. And I really do think that Darren probably has something to add to this this conversation, just based off from that I don't think we can go real deep into it, but I think that it's important to mention a few things here.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I wanted to sort of just play out was some of the history too.
Yes.
Betsy, sorry, it's
great.
not exactly on your thing. It's in my mind that I got stuck on it. The state of Maine Constitution contemplates in the electors section Indians not taxed as a category of people who can't vote. Mm-hmm. But by imagining a notion of a person not taxed, it actually, in the state constitution, and Maine is one of only 5 states that actually put this in the state constitution, it actually imagines a different sovereign, wherein the Indians will have their own right to self-government because they will be participating there and not tax or own land or participate in the state of Maine. Mm-hmm. So this is the implication of that language in 1819, 1820 when the Constitution's passed. But of course, that quickly turns, on its head, and you start to see, in terms of it becoming racialized by the Murch versus Tomer decision in 1842. The Maine Supreme Court is talking about Indians as imbeciles, right? So we cannot function without this sort of paternalism, not only in our own society as Native nations, but in the functioning of mainstream Maine society. So both of those threads are in us. I think, there are other problems with the Constitution, and there's this whole thing in the 19th century where the acts of separation and our treaty rights get silenced also. But, I think, it's that recognition right from 1820, makes actually Sherri's point kind of even more salient in terms of the willful ignorance. There is a notion and a contemplation in the very founding documents of the state that we as tribal nations are our own sovereign entities. And I think this notion, this ongoing notion that we shouldn't somehow be in control of our own destiny, and that we're incapable of doing so, are so intimately tied with racism that it's hard to, I don't know if I fully understand the rationale against tribal sovereignty. I mean, I understand that fear, I understand that piece of it, and perhaps a bit of uncertainty, but I find no evidence. So I have a PhD, I'm a scholar. I only look to the evidence around these things. The states where tribes and states formulate relations as sovereigns together are far more mutually prosperous, are far more equitable, have much healthier native and non-native citizens. I don't really know the full rationale, because if you look at the situations where tribes and states have said, yes, we will, it actually decreases uncertainty. I get from the statements that the governor feels like this would create more uncertainty, but I disagree 100% with that. It actually decreases uncertainty because of these legal and juridical relationships that are normalized across the tribal nations. There's all this common law, almost all the disputes have been settled. I mean, of course, there's back and forth and whatnot, but it actually decreases uncertainty. And there are so many protections for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous citizens in these relations of sovereignty. I don't get it. Like, I really just, like, show me where just give me some evidence, like, where this will actually lead to something that is less certain and less fair than what we currently have. I just cannot find any evidence of it.
Well, and so doesn't that point to Sherri's point about not only willful ignorance, but it's just willful racism? It's willful, putting our thumb on,
That's you. That's your language. No, I'm joking.
But no, I mean, because as you say, as I understand, two of the sticking points still are taxation and what's going to happen in the courts, right, in the tribal courts, which are models of what courts should look like, right? And so you're right that the uncertainty and also the level of restorative justice and all that kind of stuff is something we want to model after, as our environmental practice and everything else. So when you try and think like what is the rationale, it's pretty hard to find any logical intellectual rationale, and then it just leaves the racism and the paternalism, right?
I think there's a real lack of information out there. And I've been astounded by the levels of ignorance expressed by legislators. Absolutely dumbfounded, struck dumb. I just in the last month, I had a legislator in the Maine legislature who said, I don't know how this works. There's like a Wabanaki nation, and then there's sub-tribes or something under this one tribe of Wabanaki. Like, they don't even have any concept of who their original peoples are of this land. They don't know that Wabanaki is a confederacy, like the Iroquois Confederacy, and that there's 5 tribes underneath that confederacy. They don't have any understanding. There's no basic understanding for some of these individuals who are chosen to be making decisions at a state level. And I think that's very dangerous. But I also think that you look at entire populations of people who vote against their own interests.
Right.
There are entire groups of people who consistently vote against their own interests because they are led by in-group and out-group triggers that are based on histories of exclusion. Like, I'm recognized by who I can exclude rather than who I include. If we look at the history of this nation, it's all been about exclusion and inclusion, out-group, in-group,
who's out.
included at different periods through history. And Indigenous peoples are consistently on the very, very bottom. We're the others have had to elevate themselves against in order to find their place within this country. When we look at that history, the only uncertainty that the governor could possibly be talking about is the uncertainty of how European Americans or white people are now supposed to behave in relation to Indigenous peoples if they have an equal place at the table. Like, we don't know how to behave as though Indigenous people are fully human beings with an equitable voice and a sense of sovereignty or self-governance that we have to recognize. Continue to see them as subhuman and someone who is beneath us and under our control. That's the only uncertainty, is how do we behave in a just and equitable world?
And I totally agree. At its core is the sentiment from Murch v. Tomer that we're imbeciles, and that we cannot either govern ourselves or make decisions that would impact people not us. And I just find the whole, like pretending that it's something else, kind of weird. It just doesn't hold together. I like, this would get rid of all these like lawsuits. They would get rid of not all of them. 90% of the lawsuits that we are engaged in as tribal nations in the state have to do with things that are otherwise pretty well settled in federal Indian law.
Yes. Right.
So it's just I'm stuck now on the fact that I just don't get it, and I can't. And maybe you should have had counterpoint on here for someone who was like, down with the tribes, I don't trust them or whatever. But
well, I think the counterpoint is what's actually happening, right? I think even in these last negotiations, the state has consistently asked the tribes to come in and as co-equals and then negotiate against themselves. It's sort of that whole basis. And so unbelievably, we are running out of time here, but we're going to continue this conversation online. So you can find us at YouTube on Maine Challenge if you want to consider this. And I just want to say before we go officially right here, but then we will continue, is that there are two pieces of legislation, LD 1568 and LD 1626, that take at least the pieces that were agreed upon by the commission that looked at the Indian land claims again and opened it up. They're going to be heard on May 4th, we understand. So please pay attention, those of you watching, and please hop over. If you're not on the YouTube channel, hop over and we will continue this because we haven't even started, because we haven't scratched the surface. So thank you both, and we will continue. But it is such an honor to have both of you and the incredible years of scholarship and work and persistence that you've had. So thank you for being with us on Maine Challenge, and we will continue this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
And let's just keep going. So I'm sorry that you're stuck, Darren, because it's it's true. It's like what to hear about it. It's heartbreaking. It's wrong. It's all of those things, and it's a little incomprehensible, especially when you look at it. That fear factor of as self-governance, as restoring something that was stolen, that was taken, was domineeringly taken. That's not even a word, but anyway. So I think that's huge. And I think one of the things that I was reading in getting ready for talking with both of you is that since the Indian Land Claims Act was settled here in 1980, there have been over 180 pieces of legislation that provide additional economic help, ability to apply for FEMA funds, for violence against women funds, for health stuff that the Wabanaki tribes in Maine have not been able to access because they have not been granted the right to govern themselves. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's actually what it is. I'll take a first stab at it, Sherri.
Yeah, please.
Is in the Settlement Act, there is the provision that basically says our tribal nations here, will not be presumed to be part of any future legislation. So any legislation after 1980. that would recognize and create programs for tribal nations into the future. So it's an exempting clause, and that it says that we have to be named in those pieces of legislation specifically, not just included under tribes or tribal nations or federally recognized tribes, whatever language they use. And so we've been exempted. So this language has, once again, why this was included and how this actually settles land disputes is not part of anything that seems logical or fair. And I just, it doesn't make sense, but maybe Sherri, I'm missing some of it too.
I think it's also important to recognize, Darren and Betsy, that exempting language, that clause, was added in, and the tribes have always disputed that was part of the agreement that they had signed and agreed to. That wasn't present in the agreement that the tribes had signed. From the very beginning, as soon as it became apparent, they said, where did that come from? That wasn't in the document that we negotiated. And so that's very important to recognize, that somebody slipped that in after the tribes had signed an agreement that did not have that clause in there. And again, we're talking about trickery, right? And deception. And so when we try to contemplate or understand how these things might happen, I think it's important to go back to what Darren was talking about earlier when we're talking about the shifting narrative. So we have a contemplation in the 1818 to 1820 documentation that was leading up to the founding of the state of Maine, when Massachusetts Bay Colony was giving statehood to Maine, right? There was a transfer of some power that existed there, that there was actually a contemplation of the tribes as independent sovereigns, and that Maine would be negotiating with the tribes in a sovereign to sovereign basis, or on a sovereign to sovereign basis. And then we see the shifting of the language. So we see that there, and then we go forward, and in the case that Darren referenced, we see the language of imbeciles, right? And then we go forward a little more, and all of the language outlining Maine's responsibility to the tribal nations is removed by an amendment to the Maine Constitution, where they say, oh, those things still exist, but we're removing them permanently from the Maine Constitution, so that nobody's ever going to be able to find them again, right? We're prohibiting the publishing of them. And so if you understand how the law works, when somebody's trying to make a decision on a case related to tribal rights, they're going to go to the law, and they're going to see, well, let me look, what is the delineated law here for the tribes? What rights do the tribes have? And if an adjudicator of the law is going to look for the information that outlines the rights of the tribes, and the state of Maine, by an amendment to their constitution, has prohibited the publishing of that law, how are they ever going to make a determination that is in alignment with the standing law? I mean, that right there is just maddeningly criminal.
Yeah, and so wrong, so wrong. And then yesterday I heard for the first time, and you probably have known about this for a long time, but Representative Jeff Evangelos shared a memo from Richard Cohen, who was the Attorney General at the time of this, saying like this. It's horrifying, saying, oh, hey, we have the best stealing of, we have taken away more rights than anybody else in the country. And isn't this awesome? When the narrative to the rest of the state, right, and this was, I guess, just unearthed. I don't know. That's what I heard anyway. But the narrative was like, oh, this is this fair treaty that we've come up with together, and we've settled this all together. And meanwhile, at the very time it was being written, in addition to the trickery that you talked about, things that were added after the signing had happened, here is the Attorney General of the state saying, oh, hey, we really did, this was really great, you guys. We didn't give them anything. And so, again, if you're looking at it from a legal perspective, I'm not a lawyer, but if you're looking from a legal perspective, but also from the sort of cultural history of understanding what happened. I can remember, Governor Brennan at the time crowing about how great this was and getting Jimmy Carter to sign it. And it was, it's appalling to look at what actually happened. And now, as you said, Darren, and now the resistance to fixing it and changing is equally appalling.
I just want to, I think I'd just like to play out a little bit of this, just for educational purposes, in terms of, what the Settlement Act did and how it's been interpreted. Starting in 1972 with the Passamaquoddy versus Morton case, right, where basically we're being recognized as federally recognized tribes, and that the Department of Interior, the federal government, has a duty, an affirmative duty, to protect our interests as tribal nations. From then until the Settlement Act is signed in 1980, we are winning court cases, which are recognizing our jurisdictions, our sovereignty, repeatedly in state and federal court, consistent with the other forms of federal tribal sovereign arrangements, and that to the extent that the municipality language was explained to anyone on the tribal side, it was always, when it was pointed out, unlike the clause exempting us from all these other things, it was always said, well, this is like a shield, in terms of, would there be this vacuum of space or legislative control? I'm not saying people should have bought that, or that was actually communicated to everyone, but also in the federal legislation, in the official record, it says repeatedly, well, 2 or 3 times, it says two or three times, that the Settlement Act is in no way a denigration of tribal sovereignty for Maine tribes. And yet its literal effect was to undermine these court cases that had been happening in the 70s, recognizing our inherent sovereignty, and that it splashes all this cold water on it because of the clauses, even though the intent at the federal level, it's in the legislative record, says if anything, it's an enhancement of tribal sovereignty. So I just, in terms of the reconstructions around how these things work, I just want to set those records straight as well, because I think people don't understand, again, like, and then, the other side of this, and this is my last point, maybe, people are like, well, but you accepted all the, the money and the land and all that. And so I'm happy to be like, okay, let's just give it all back and then start over, because then it still clouds title to 2/3 of the state of Maine. And then suddenly we're not, so yeah, like, absolutely undo it, and let's start over. Because just because we undo the Settlement Act doesn't mean that the clouded title, because lands were illegally taken from us as tribes, that means that returns as a problem for both the state and any other economic interest. So it's kind of crazy that, we feel like we're in such a weak position, because intellectually and framework wise, we should be actually calling the shots around how this is the contours of this, and not negotiating with ourselves for less than.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of calling the shots, one of the things that I think is a fear that doesn't get talked about is in terms of the rights to the river and the water and the land, right? So there's a lot of corporations that are worried that environmental regulations will become stricter. And then there's some people on the environmental side who say, they'll be less strict. And to me, it's like, okay, let's start from the beginning and let's go to the tribes and indigenous people who actually revere the earth and actually, and so to me, I think some of that fear, though, is what fuels, and they can't say it, right? Because now here we have climate change and we've screwed everything up and the earth is dying and we're killing Mother Earth. And yet, so it's hard to say, well, we want to keep doing that. So what we're really afraid of is the indigenous folks won't let us do that anymore. So that's what we're afraid of. You can't really say that. So then they have to come up with all these other things to say, right?
I think in that regard, this is one of the reasons why sovereignty matters so much. Because the exercise of sovereignty demonstrates what is the political agenda of certain peoples. What are their cultural regularities? Their methods and forms of governance, right? This is what sovereignty demonstrates to us. And so if you want to get an accurate picture of what the future might hold, then look at what history has demonstrated about, specifically talking about the Penobscot River. The Penobscot Nation, because of the impacts of pollution, corporate pollution, in the Penobscot River and the health impacts in our communities, formed partnerships with more than 30 different groups up and down the Penobscot River, created an ally network, and worked for 30 years plus to restore to the current state of health the Penobscot River. So that there has been an increase in fisheries, that we have had indigenous fish that have returned to the Penobscot River that had been absent for decades.
Decades, yeah.
Corporate pollution, created fish runs in the river for the restoration of the fisheries. When I was a kid, we couldn't swim in the river. Now kids are able to swim in the river. We're able to recreate in the river. And we continue to have those partnerships and those alliances on the river. The only thing that has happened has been beneficial to everyone that lives along that waterway. And so,
absolutely.
If we want to look at what is the real potential, because there's always like, well, what if the tribes do this? And what if the tribes do that? And it's like some crazy, insane, racist ideology that's being projected forward. And history is the best proof of what the future will hold, right? And so if we look at the history, then we have an idea of how the tribes would be as sovereigns working in a sovereign to sovereign relationship.
Yes.
We've already demonstrated our capacity to do that, even without recognition of our sovereignty by the state.
Right.
And so, I think that that's really important. And I think, as Dr. Ranco, Darren has stated earlier, it's important to recognize that this is in the best interest of the state of Maine.
Yes.
There's all kinds of ways that this could go very badly for the state of Maine over time if this is not handled in a way that is mutually beneficial to us both.
Yeah.
And so the tribes have the high ground here.
Yes.
In this debate. And we also have the persistence through time to stand on that high ground.
Yes.
Eventually, as we're seeing, inequity and injustice is being addressed at a far greater rate than it ever has been. And that trend is going to continue. And so we have the historical record. Now it's time for the state of Maine to rectify its own history.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sherri's words are pretty hard to follow. I would say that, there are very few pieces of legislation that have the opportunity to actually mutually benefit tribal folks and the state of Maine. And I'll just return to my understanding and my studies and my work in this area, that settling this and pushing it in this direction benefits tribal folks in our state, but it benefits the state of Maine in general. That the states where this is sorted out towards mutual benefit and settled law, like federal Indian law, those states are better off, have better overall economic and other kinds of opportunities, working collaboratively with tribal nations. And I just think it's such an important part of our collective future in Maine to work together on this. So that's again, I'm too baffled as to not knowing why we wouldn't do this like yesterday, but I'm really excited about this as a possibility for everyone in Maine.
Wow. And that actually sounds like a really powerful place to stop, because it is time for Maine to rectify its own history, which is not a good one. And so again, I just want to say to folks who are listening, there are 2 pieces of legislation that are coming up that will help begin, at least I'm sure it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect, but it will begin to move us in the direction of equality and getting back to where we should have been, and to self-governance for the tribes in Maine. And we can join the rest of the country that has already recognized that. And it will bring the benefits of, even things like we don't think about, like emergency management and healthcare and things that allow the tribes to negotiate directly with the federal government without having to go through Maine's frame, whatever that happens to be. And so it's really important. So contact your legislator, talk to people, have conversations about this. I mean, both Darren and Sherri, Dr. Ranco and Sherri have helped us so much with shifting the framework. I know for me, really importantly. And so now it's our job to go out and talk to our neighbors and our friends and to change that framework and to make sure that we are talking about this in a way that's not from a white European idea of sovereignty, but from actually returning and giving back what we have stolen and empowering the people to govern themselves, allowing, or it sounds crazy, not allowing, what's the right word? It's not allowing, just like recognizing the empowerment and the self-governance of the tribes as it has been and should always be, and for thousands and thousands of years. So I ask that you take action. This is not something that we can sit back about. This is something that the time has more than come. It is way late, and we better catch up. So thank you, Darren, Dr. Ranco, and Sherri. Thank you for your work, for who you are, for your persistence and your incredible patience with those of us who try and work to be allies and continuing to move us forward. So thank you for helping us with that today and for being part of Maine Challenge. You are awesome.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you so much.